It was summer of 2000, hot and humid, the kind of Missouri summer that sticks to you like glue. I was Jessica, then just turning 15. My best friend Emily, she was the same age, and her older brother Michael, he was 16. We lived in Columbia, and you know how it is in smaller cities, everyone thinks they know everything about their town. We definitely thought we did, especially when it came to the woods and trails around us. We were always out biking, exploring. We knew all the shortcuts, the best swimming holes, all those teen summer things. That particular day, we decided to try a trail we hadn't been on in ages, the one that kind of winds out past Grindstone Nature Area, heading vaguely south towards Rock Bridge. It's not super remote or anything, it's still near neighborhoods, but this part was always quieter, more overgrown. Less people bothered with it, which for us, at the time, was part of the appeal. The trail was paved, but cracked in places, weeds pushing up through. It was that deep summer green. Everything was just bursting, leaves thick and heavy on the trees, bushes overgrown. It was hot even in the shade of the woods, the air still and thick, humming with cicadas. We were just talking, you know, kid stuff. Emily was complaining about her summer reading list. Michael was talking about wanting to get his license, and I was probably just zoning out and listening to them. We were biking along, not going fast, just cruising. The trail kind of curved to the left, and there's this little dip in the ground there, a shallow ravine on the right side of the trail that slopes down into the denser woods. That's where it happened. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something pale. It wasn't a deer. I knew deer. We saw them all the time on these trails. This was different. It came out of the woods on the right, from down in that ravine, just walked out onto the path right in front of us, and it was like everything just stopped. Not literally stopped, but inside, like the world went quiet for a second. The first thing I noticed, even before what it was just how wrong it felt. Like something that shouldn't be there, shouldn't be possible. It wasn't making any noise coming out of the woods, no snapping twigs, no rustling leaves, nothing. It just appeared, like it was already there, but our brains just registered it now. And then I really saw it. It was tall, unbelievably tall. I mean, Michael is already pretty tall, maybe pushing 6 feet then, but this thing towered over him. I'd guess, even now, looking back, easily 6.5 feet, maybe more. And skinny, not just thin, but gaunt, like stretched out and too thin. Like all the height was stolen from width. It was grey. Everything about it was grey. Its skin or fur or whatever it was covered in, a dingy, muddy grey, almost the colour of dirty concrete. Not like animal fur grey, if that makes sense. More like decaying fabric grey. It looked rough, uneven, and hung off it in loose patches, almost like mange. But it wasn't mange, not really. It was just the texture of it, like old threadbare carpet left out in the rain. And the way it moved, it was on 2 legs, completely upright, but it didn't move like a person. It was jerky, like it wasn't used to walking like that. And kind of bouncy too, almost like a monkey, but not as agile. More like a slow, stretched-out monkey. That's the closest I can get to describing it even now, after all this time. Monkey-like, but elongated and wrong. Its arms were long, too, hanging down past its knees, and its hands. I didn't really get a good look at them, but they looked thin and bony, ending in something, I don't know if they were claws or nails, but something sharpish, darker grey, maybe blackish, at the ends of its fingers, like dirty fingernails, but too long and pointed. Its head was small for its body, too small and narrow. It didn't really have a neck to speak of. The head just kind of sat on top of its shoulders, hunched over. And its face, that's the part that really sticks with me. It was canine-like, but not quite. Like a dog, maybe, but stretched out and warped. Long snout, too long, almost pointed like a greyhound, but again, wrong. Everything was just a little too much, or too little, not quite fitting together right. And the eyes were dark, completely black. No whites, no pupils, just black, like holes punched into its face, and they were deep set, like they were set way back in its skull, under heavy brow ridges. You could see shadows over them even in the bright sunlight. And they were fixed on us. They weren't darting around, not looking at the trees or the path or anything else, just fixed directly on us. It didn't growl, it didn't snarl, it didn't make any noise at all. It just walked, slowly, deliberately, across the path, right in front of us. It didn't speed up, didn't slow down. It just kept that same weird, jerky, bouncy walk, going straight across the trail and into the woods on the other side. Just disappeared into the trees like it was nothing. And the thing is, it wasn't aggressive. That's what was so terrifying. It wasn't snarling, it wasn't attacking, it wasn't even really acknowledging us in a way that felt like a threat, exactly. It was more like we were something in its path, like a rock or a tree, something it had to walk around but not something it cared about. That's what messed with me the most. It wasn't angry, it wasn't trying to scare us. It just was, and it was completely and utterly unnatural. And it acted like seeing us was the most normal thing in the world, even though it was the most unnormal thing I'd ever seen in my life. We were frozen, all three of us, just stopped dead on the path, bikes wobbling under us, watching it walk across. I remember the sound of the cicadas suddenly getting louder after it stepped out onto the path, like they had been holding their breath too, and then just resumed. Everything else was silent. My breath, Emily's, Michael's. I don't think any of us were even breathing. It crossed the path and just kept going into the woods on the other side. No noise as it went in either, just gone. Like it had been a shadow that had passed over us and then lifted. And then it was like a switch flipped. We didn't say anything, not a word. We didn't look at each other. We didn't have to. We all knew. We just turned our bikes around at the exact same moment, and we started pedaling. Fast. Faster than we'd ever pedaled before. Not yelling, not screaming, just pure, silent, terror-fueled pedaling. We didn't stop until we were back on the main road, back in neighborhoods where we could see houses and hear cars. We rode straight to Emily's house, dumped our bikes in the yard, and just went inside. We sat in her living room for hours, I think, without really talking, just sitting. The TV was on, some stupid daytime show, but nobody was watching it. We were just there, staring. Eventually, Michael broke the silence. He said, voice shaky, Did you guys see that?" Emily and I just nodded, slowly. What was that?" he asked. He looked scared, genuinely scared. I'd never seen Michael scared like that before. He was always the tough older brother, the one who laughed at scary movies and teased us for being afraid of the dark. But he was terrified now, and so were we. I don't know," I whispered. Emily just shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. We tried to talk about it. But how do you even talk about something like that? We described it to each other, tried to make sense of it. But the words just sounded wrong, too small, too normal for what we had seen. We said it was tall, skinny, grey, walked on two legs, had a dog-like face, black eyes, but that didn't even come close to capturing what it was. It was like trying to describe a colour to someone who's blind. The words are there, but they don't mean anything. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a person in a costume. But it didn't look like a costume. It looked real, too real. And it moved, wrong. And it was too tall, too skinny. And where would someone get a costume like that? And why would they be walking around in the woods like that, in the middle of the day, in the heat? Maybe it was an animal, a weird kind of dog. But what kind of dog walks upright and looks like that? And is that tall? And moves like that? It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't anything we could name. It wasn't anything that belonged in those woods, or anywhere, really. We tried to tell ourselves we imagined it, that we were tired, dehydrated, the heat got to us, something, but we all saw it, all three of us. We saw the same thing, at the same time. There's no way we all imagined it. We never told anyone else. Not our parents, not our friends, nobody. Who would believe us? They'd think we were crazy, making it up for attention, or just seeing things, being teenagers. And honestly, we didn't want to talk about it. Not really. It felt private, like something that happened to just us, and something we needed to keep just to ourselves, like if we told someone it would somehow become less real, or more likely, maybe too real. And we couldn't handle that. We avoided that bike path after that. For years, actually. We still biked other trails, but never that one, never that section of woods. Even driving by, I'd feel a chill, like something was still there, watching. It's been over 20 years now. I'm a grown woman. I live in a different city, but I still think about it. Sometimes, out of nowhere, it'll just pop into my head. That grey figure walking across the path. Those black eyes staring, the complete unsettling silence. I've looked online, tried to find anything at all that could explain it. Cryptids, folklore, anything weird or unexplained in Missouri. I found stories, of course, stories about dogmen, skinwalkers, all sorts of things. Some of them kind of fit, a little bit, but not really. Nothing exactly matches what we saw, and part of me doesn't want to know, doesn't want an explanation, because whatever we saw that day, it wasn't normal, it wasn't natural, and I don't think it was supposed to be seen. Sometimes I wonder if it was just lost, strayed from somewhere else, something that doesn't belong here, and then I think maybe it does belong there. Maybe it's always been there, hidden in the woods, just outside of our sight, just on the edge of what we know, what we understand. And maybe that day we just accidentally stumbled across it, and it just happened to be walking from one part of the woods to another, and we were just in the way. I don't know. I'll never know. And that's the part that still scares me, even after all this time. The not knowing, the certainty that we saw something real, something wrong, and the feeling, deep down, that it's still out there, somewhere in those woods, or woods just like them, waiting for someone else to accidentally cross its path. And the worst part, the absolute worst, chilling part, is that in all those years, in all those woods we've explored, the countless animals, the strange noises, the weird things you see in nature sometimes, nothing has ever felt even remotely close to that. That feeling of utter, primal wrongness. It was like a glitch in reality, like for those few seconds the rules of the world just bent, and we saw what was on the other side of that bend, and I have no idea what it was, and I really, really don't want to again. Ever. Story 2. It was March of 2010. I remember it clear as day, because it was just after my birthday, and the weather still had that nasty edge to it. Me and Mark, my buddy since forever, we got this bee in our bonnets about Bigfoot. I know, sounds ridiculous now thinking back, but at the time, we were hooked. We'd spent weeks watching every documentary, reading every forum post, you name it. We convinced ourselves that if there was anywhere to see something like that, it had to be the Pine Barrens here in Jersey. Everyone's heard the stories, right? Weird things happening out there. So, we planned this whole thing out like it was some military operation. We packed up my old Jeep, filled it with flashlights, cameras, even had one of those infrared things Mark borrowed from his uncle who does. I don't even know what he does. Some kind of surveillance stuff. Anyway, we were serious. Too serious, maybe. We figured late afternoon would be the best time, when it's starting to get dark, but not completely pitch black yet. We drove out towards Burlington County, hitting those back roads that wind through the pines. Even in the daytime, those woods are something else. Tall, skinny trees packed in so tight, it feels like the sunlight's getting choked out before it even hits the ground. It was misty that day, real thick, like driving through soup. Everything was muted, colors were dull, and the fog hung low, wrapping around the trees like ghosts. It was creepy, even before anything weird happened, just being out there with that fog. We parked the Jeep off one of those dirt tracks, the kind that look like they haven't been touched in years, and got out. The air was freezing. You know that damp cold that just sinks right into your bones? That was it. And the silence. That's the first thing that really struck me. City boy like me, I'm used to noise, constant background hum. Out there it was just nothing. No cars, no planes, not even birds singing, not really. Just this heavy, muffling silence, like the fog was swallowing up all the sound. We started walking deeper into the woods. Flashlights cutting beams through the mist, making those weird cones of light in the dark. We were calling out every now and then, those stupid Bigfoot calls you hear on TV, hooting and hollering, feeling like complete idiots. Mark was recording everything on his camera, narrating our expedition like we were Steve Irwin in the outback, except instead of crocodiles, we were after, well, nothing really. We knew deep down we weren't going to see anything, but there's still that little part of you that hopes, you know, that maybe, just maybe, there's something out there. We hiked for a couple of hours, I guess. It got darker and darker. The mist just wouldn't lift, and the cold got worse. Honestly, after a while, it stopped being exciting and started being just plain uncomfortable. We were freezing, our feet were wet from the damp ground, and we hadn't heard or seen a damn thing except trees and fog. Even the forest sounds you expect, like crickets or owls, were muted or gone. It was just silent. That heavy, oppressive silence. Mark, he was starting to get jumpy. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, he was swinging around with the flashlight like he expected a bear to jump out or something. I was trying to play it cool, but I was feeling it too. That feeling of being watched, even when you know there's nothing to be watched by. It's that feeling like the woods are alive, and they're looking back at you. Finally, I called it, "Dude, this is pointless. We're freezing our butts off and seeing nothing. Let's just head back, get some pizza, and watch a movie. Way better Bigfoot hunt than this." Mark didn't argue. He was just as ready to go. We turned around, retraced our steps back to the Jeep, the flashlights now more focused on the ground to avoid tripping on roots. The walk back felt faster, probably just because we knew we were heading back to warmth and light. We got to the Jeep, shivering and relieved. I started the engine, heater blasting on full, and we both just sat there for a minute, letting the warmth soak in. Then we pulled back onto that dirt track to get back to the main road. That track was narrow, trees right up close on both sides. It was completely dark now, black as pitch outside the headlights. The fog seemed even thicker at ground level, swirling and creeping across the road like smoke. It was late, I guess, maybe 9 or 10. I didn't check my watch, just wanted to get home. I was driving maybe 20-25 mph, slow because of the fog and the dirt track, just following the beam of the headlights, listening to the tires crunching on the gravel. Mark was in the passenger seat, fiddling with the radio, trying to get a signal, but all we got was static. Then he just gave up, and we drove in silence again. That silence. It was different now. It wasn't just the quiet of the woods anymore. It was a thick, tense silence, like something was building, something was about to happen. I can't explain it, but you know that feeling? When the hair on the back of your neck stands up, even before you know why. We were driving along, headlights cutting through the fog, and then it happened. It was on the right side of the road, hidden in the darkness and fog, and then it just burst out. 1 second, nothing. The next second, this massive shadow lunging out of the trees, straight into the road. It was so fast, so sudden, I barely registered what it was before I slammed on the brakes. Tires screeched, the Jeep lurched forward and then skidded sideways. Everything happened in slow motion like a nightmare. I saw the hood dip, heard Mark yell something, and felt the car sliding on the gravel. For a split second I thought we were going to flip, but then somehow we stopped. Just inches, maybe a foot, from the edge of the road, right where the woods started again. The engine stalled. Everything was silent again, except my heart pounding in my ears like a drum solo. Mark was frozen, his eyes wide, staring straight ahead. I was too, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. It took a second for my brain to catch up, to even realize what had just happened. We'd almost hit something big. "What the hell was that?" Mark finally whispered, his voice shaking. I shook my head, trying to breathe, trying to get my bearings. I don't know. I think it was an animal. Deer, maybe. But it was huge. I restarted the engine, put the Jeep in park, and slowly, carefully, turned off the headlights. We were sitting in total darkness now, surrounded by the fog and the trees and that oppressive silence. For a second, I just wanted to floor it, get the hell out of there, back to civilization, back to light and noise and people. But curiosity, stupid curiosity, got the better of me. Let's just take a look, I said, my voice still shaky. Just to see what it was. Mark hesitated. Are you crazy? What if it's still there? Then we'll get back in the car and go, just for a second, with the flashlights. He reluctantly agreed. We fumbled for the flashlights, switched them on, and carefully opened the car doors. The cold hit us again, like a slap in the face. We stepped out, shining the lights towards the road ahead, towards where whatever it was had come from. The fog was thick, swirling in the beams of the flashlights. For a moment I didn't see anything, just the dirt road, the fog, the trees. And then slowly my eyes adjusted, and I saw it. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. It was shaped like an animal, I guess. Tall, bigger than a person. That much I could tell even in the fog. But the proportions were all wrong. It was hunched over, low to the ground, almost like it was crawling, but moving impossibly fast. And it wasn't furry or hairy like an animal. It looked smooth, almost leathery, dark, like shadows were clinging to it. And the way it moved, that's what really messed me up. It wasn't running on all fours like a dog or a deer. It was more like a crouched sprint, like it was propelling itself forward with its arms and legs in this weird, unnatural way. Its limbs were thick, too thick, disproportionately thick for its body. But the worst thing, the thing that I can still see when I close my eyes, was its face, or lack of face. It didn't have a snout. It didn't have a muzzle. Just this flat, blank space. And in that space, two eyes. Just eyes. No other features, just these eyes that caught the beam of my flashlight and glowed. Not an animal glow, not like a deer's eyes reflecting light. This was different. It was like they were glowing from inside, with their own light. And they were surprised. That's the only word I can think of. Not angry, not aggressive. Surprised, like we'd interrupted something, like it hadn't expected us to be there. It was only there for a few seconds, maybe less. 1 second, lunging into the road, next second, almost hitting us. And then, in the brief flash of the headlights and the flashlight beams, I saw it clearly. This thing, this creature, and then it was gone. It vanished back into the woods on the other side of the road as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the darkness and the fog. Just gone, like it had never been there at all. Mark and I just stood there, frozen again, flashlights still pointed at the empty road, the silence even heavier now than before. We didn't move, didn't speak, for what felt like forever. Finally, I found my voice, but it was just a croak. Did you see that? Mark just nodded slowly, his face pale in the flashlight beam. Yeah, I saw it. What? What was it? He shook his head again, still not saying anything. I turned off the flashlights, plunged us back into total darkness. Get in the car, I said, my voice stronger now, adrenaline starting to kick in. Let's get the hell out of here. We scrambled back into the Jeep, doors slamming, engine roaring back to life. I put it in drive, spun the wheels on the gravel and took off, not even looking back. We flew down that dirt track, bouncing over ruts and potholes, the trees flashing by in the headlights. I drove faster than I should have, didn't care about anything except getting away. We didn't say a word to each other the whole way back to the main road, the whole drive home. Just sat there in silence, both of us staring straight ahead, our minds racing, trying to process what we'd seen. When we finally got back to my place, parked in my driveway, I turned off the engine and just sat there again, catching my breath. Mark finally spoke, his voice still quiet, still shaken. What do you think it was? I didn't know what to say. Sasquatch? Jersey Devil? Some kind of something else? It didn't fit anything I'd ever heard of. It wasn't like the Bigfoot stories we'd been reading. It was wrong, something fundamentally wrong about it. I don't know, I said finally. I honestly have no idea. Did you see its face? Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. Yeah, I said. No face, just eyes. We sat there for a long time, not talking, just staring out into the dark. Eventually, Mark just said, I'm going home. He got out of the car, walked to his own car, and drove off. I watched him go, then went inside, locked the door, and didn't sleep a wink that night. The next day, we didn't talk about it. Not really. We mentioned it briefly, like it was some weird dream we both had, some trick of the light in the fog. We tried to explain it away, to make it something normal, something we could understand. Deer in the mist, playing tricks with our eyes. Anything but what it really was. But we both knew, we both saw it, and we both knew it wasn't a deer. I've never been back to the Pine Barrens since, haven't even driven near there. And Mark, he moved away a couple of years later, said he was tired of Jersey. Maybe he was, or maybe he was just tired of remembering that night. To this day, I can't explain what we saw. I've tried to forget it, tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but I can't. The way it moved, the way it looked, those eyes. It was real. I know it was real. And sometimes, late at night, when it's quiet and dark, I still think about it. Think about that creature, out there in the woods, still running through the shadows. And I wonder what else is out there, hidden just beyond the edge of our headlights, waiting in the fog, waiting for us to drive by again. And I still have no damn idea what it was. And that's the thing that keeps me up at night, even now. The not knowing. The absolute terrifying not knowing. Nay. Story 3. Okay, so this happened a while back, but honestly, it still messes with me. I'm not someone who gets spooked easily. I mean, I've been hunting and fishing my whole life, out in the woods and water, sometimes days at a time, alone. Florida woods, too. It's not like I'm afraid of the dark or critters or whatever. I've seen snakes bigger than my leg, hogs that could rip your arm off, alligators that make your blood run cold just by looking at them across a swamp. Never bothered me much. Nature is nature, you know. Respect it, be smart, and you're generally okay. This wasn't nature. Not in the way I understand it anyway. It was supposed to be a regular hunt. Primitive weapons area down south, outside of Okeechobee. Means no fancy rifles, just muzzle loaders, bows, stuff like that. Keeps it quiet, which I like. Gets you back to basics. This particular spot was deep in. Real desolate feeling. They call it that for a reason. Primitive. You go in there, you're stepping back in time. Kind of feels like it. It's just you and the trees and whatever else is breathing out there. I'd scouted the place a week before, found a decent area off an old logging road. Not really a road anymore, more like a overgrown track. Perfect spot. Felt right. Set up my little folding stool at the base of a big old pine tree, overlooking a kind of bend in this track. Figured deer or maybe a hog would come through there. Morning was quiet, real quiet. Just the usual rustling leaves, birds chirping far off. The kind of quiet that's actually loud if you pay attention. Sun was coming up, filtering through the trees, making everything look kinda hazy and gold. It was a good morning to be out there, you know. Peaceful. Around mid-morning, things started to feel off. Not drastically, just a little tickle in the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. You get that sometimes in the woods, especially alone. Your senses get heightened. I shrugged it off, figured it was just my imagination getting carried away. I started walking down the logging track in a horseshoe shape, real slow, rifle across my chest, eyes peeled. Figured I'd circle around, come back to my stool. That's when I saw it, just a flash. Out of the corner of my eye, over in the thicker trees like something moved, quick, real quick. I stopped dead still, heart skipped a beat. Figured it was a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But when I turned my head, slowly, nothing. Just trees, thick underbrush, shadows playing tricks maybe. What made it weird though, what stuck in my mind, was the shape. It wasn't deer-shaped or hog-shaped. It was almost like a person, but not quite. Too hunched and dark, really dark, almost black against the green of the trees. For a split second, and I swear to God I saw it, it looked like a monkey. I know, sounds crazy. Florida woods ain't got no monkeys running wild, not that I've ever heard of. My brain must have just glitched out. Sun in my eyes, tiredness, whatever. I blinked, looked again, and it was gone. Nothing there. I shook my head, tried to laugh it off. Getting jumpy, Donnie, I muttered to myself. Too much coffee. I kept walking, slower now, paying more attention to the woods around me, trying to be quiet as possible. That's when I heard it. Snap. Loud. Like a branch breaking, but way bigger, from the swampy area off to my right, deeper in the woods. Didn't sound like an animal. Too heavy, too sharp. Snap. Again. Closer this time, and then another one. Snap. Even closer. Like something big and clumsy was moving through the woods, breaking branches as it went. But it wasn't like normal animal movement. It was purposeful, like it was coming towards me. My heart started pounding for real this time. That tickle in my neck went from a tickle to a cold hand. Every hair on my arms stood up. Something was wrong. Very wrong. This wasn't deer, wasn't hog, wasn't anything I recognized. Too heavy, too deliberate. And those snaps were loud, scary loud in the still morning. Instinct kicked in. Forget hunting, forget being quiet. Time to get back to my stand, get my bearings, figure out what was going on. I turned around, started moving back towards the logging track, picking up my pace, but still trying to be somewhat quiet, just in case it was something normal, like maybe a bear. And I just needed to move away slowly. I got back to my folding stool at the pine tree, grabbed my backpack, and scanned the woods around me. Everything looked the same. Trees, shadows, sunlight. But the air felt different. Thicker, heavier, like the silence had turned into pressure. The birds had stopped chirping. Everything was just still, unnaturally still. I needed to get out of there. Just a feeling, deep in my gut, telling me to go, pack it in, call it a day, get back to the truck, go home. I slung my rifle over my shoulder, grabbed my stool, and started to walk back the way I'd come, back towards the main logging road, figuring if I got out to the wider track, I'd feel safer, be able to move faster. That's when the sound happened. It's hard to describe. I've tried to explain it to people, but words just don't do it justice. Imagine the loudest dove call you've ever heard. Now multiply that by 100, 1,000, and make it deeper, more resonant. Almost painful to hear, like it was vibrating in your chest. It exploded right behind me. Blah, whoom, just ripped through the silence. So loud it felt like my eardrums were going to burst. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard in my life. Not a bird call, not a deer grunt, not a hog snort, nothing. It was alien, unnatural, and it came from directly behind me, maybe only a few yards away. I jumped. Spun around, rifle up, heart hammering so hard I thought it was going to explode out of my chest. There was nothing there, just trees, shadows, nothing moving. But the sound, the echo was still ringing in my ears, that deep, booming blah whoom fading into the trees. Fear, real bone-deep fear, finally grabbed hold of me. Not the normal wood scare you get from a snake rustling in the leaves. This was something else, something primal, something terrifying. My legs started to tremble, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I just knew, that sound hadn't been made by anything normal. And I knew in that moment that I wasn't alone out there. Not alone in the way you're alone in the woods when it's just you and the animals. I was being watched, hunted maybe, by something else. Adrenaline flooded me. Fight or flight. Flight took over instantly. I didn't even think about fighting. There was nothing to fight. Nothing I could see. Just the woods, and that sound, and the feeling of being watched by something unseen, something wrong. I dropped my stool, dropped my backpack, didn't care about any of it, just had to get out of there. I turned and ran, just ran. Full-out sprint through the trees, back towards the logging road, back towards any kind of open space. Branches whipping my face, thorns tearing at my clothes, tripping over roots. Didn't matter. Just run. As I ran, I heard it again, but this time it wasn't a sound like a dove. This time it was a scream. A long, drawn-out, chilling scream, but not human, not animal, something in between. And it wasn't just a scream, it was rhythmic, almost like a war cry. Like those old cowboy movies, you know, the ahoo, ahoo, ahoo kind of scream, but deeper, louder, more guttural, and full of malice. Ahoo, ahoo, ahoo! It echoed through the woods behind me, chasing me, cutting through the sound of my own panicked breathing, the pounding of my feet, the crashing through the underbrush. Ahoo, ahoo, ahoo! Closer now, closer and closer. I glanced over my shoulder as I ran, just for a split second. Foolish maybe, but I had to see something. But there was nothing. Just trees blurring past, shadows flickering. But the sound was definitely closer. And I heard other sounds now too. Crashing branches, heavy footsteps, following me, keeping pace with me through the thickest parts of the woods. Like whatever it was moving faster than me, or could move through the trees without making as much noise, despite being so big, judging by those branches snapping. Ahoo! 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 It kept screaming, closer and closer, mocking me, chasing me. I was sure, absolutely sure, that whatever was making that sound was hunting me, playing with me, laughing at me as I ran. It was toying with me. Terror washed over me in waves, real, gut-wrenching, soul-shaking terror. I've never felt anything like it. I thought I was going to die, right there in the woods, chased down by something I couldn't see, couldn't understand, something that was screaming at me like I was prey. My lungs were burning, legs aching, sides cramping, but I kept running. Didn't dare slow down, didn't dare stop. I just kept pushing, kept crashing through the woods, fueled by pure, unadulterated fear. The war cry screams kept coming, relentless, echoing behind me, along with the crashing branches and heavy footsteps. It felt like it was right on my heels, like it was about to grab me. My mind raced. What was it? What the hell was chasing me? Bear? Mountain lion? Neither of those sounds like that. And they wouldn't make those war cry screams. It was something else, something unknown. And that made it even worse. The not knowing, the mystery, the pure, terrifying unknown. I thought about my wife, about my kids, about how much I loved them, how I'd never see them again. I knew in that moment I was about to die. This was it. This was how it ended. Alone, terrified, in the middle of nowhere, hunted by something out of a nightmare. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket as I ran, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold onto it. Managed to unlock it, find her contact, and start typing a message. Just a few words, just in case this was it. I love you, Sarah, I typed, my fingers clumsy and slow. Forgive me. Sent it. Don't even know if it went through. Didn't have time to check. Just kept running, kept crashing, kept listening to the screams and the footsteps getting closer. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped, just like that. Silence. Complete and utter silence, except for my own ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart in my ears. The screams were gone. The footsteps were gone. The crashing branches were gone. Just silence. And the normal wood sounds slowly starting to creep back in. Birds chirping again, leaves rustling in the breeze, a distant buzzing of insects. I kept running for another minute, maybe two, just to be sure. Then I stumbled to a halt, leaning against a tree, gasping for air, legs shaking so bad they felt like jelly. I scanned the woods around me, every direction, rifle still clutched in my trembling hands. Nothing, just trees, shadows, sunlight filtering through the leaves, normal woods. I listened, waited, for a long, long time, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, more, just stood there, panting, heart hammering, listening for any sound, any sign of whatever it was. Nothing. Silence. Just the normal sounds of the woods. Slowly, cautiously, I started to breathe again, realized I was shaking all over, from head to toe, like I was freezing, even though it was a warm Florida morning. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was starting to recede, replaced by confusion, disbelief. Had it really happened? Had I imagined it all? The monkey flash, the snaps, the booming dove sound, the war cries, the footsteps. It felt so real, so terrifyingly real. But now, silence. Like nothing had ever happened. I looked around again, tried to get my bearings, realized I'd stumbled out onto the logging road. The main logging road, the one I'd parked my truck on a mile or so back. I'd made it. Somehow I'd made it back to safety. I just stood there on the road for a while, still shaking, still catching my breath, still listening, still watching, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand what had just happened. But there was no sense to be made, no explanation, just unexplained terror. Eventually, after what felt like forever, I started walking towards my truck. Each step was shaky, uncertain, like I was walking on thin ice, looking over my shoulder every few seconds, expecting to see something, anything. But there was nothing. Just the empty logging road stretching out ahead of me. I got back to my truck, fumbled with the keys, got in, locked the doors, and just sat there for a few minutes, engine idling, hands still shaking on the steering wheel, staring out at the woods, watching, waiting, for something to happen, for something to come out of the trees. But nothing did. The woods just stayed silent, empty, normal. I drove home that day. Didn't say a word to anyone for hours. Just went inside, hugged my wife and kids, and sat down, still shaking, still terrified. I told Sarah about it later that night when the kids were asleep. She listened, her eyes wide, her face pale. She didn't know what to say. I don't think she believed me at first, not really, but she could see how shaken I was, how real it felt to me. To this day, I can't explain it. Don't know what happened out there in those woods. Don't know what chased me. Don't know what made those sounds. I've tried to rationalize it, find a logical explanation, but there isn't one. Not one that makes any sense. Sometimes late at night when it's quiet, I still hear that sound in my head. Aho, aho, aho! And I remember the terror, the absolute soul-crushing terror of being hunted by something unseen, something unknown, in the dark heart of the Florida woods. And I know, deep down, that whatever it was, it's still out there, watching, waiting, in the silence of the trees. Story 4. It was summer, must have been, early 70s, yeah, around 72, 73 maybe. North Bend, Washington. Think damp pine and moss and that cool, heavy air even when the sun was out. We lived just outside of town, a decent chunk of land backed up against Rattlesnake Ridge. Me, Caleb, I was maybe 10, and my little brother Eli, he was, 7? We spent every waking minute out in the woods. It was our kingdom, our playground. Our favorite thing to do was these little alder trees down the slope from the house, kinda by the creek that ran through the property. They were young, springy, perfect for swinging on. We'd grab onto a branch, pump our legs, and just fly back and forth, back and forth. Simple stuff, but man, it was the best. That whole area, it was just woods, then some open pasture closer to the house, then woods again. Dense, thick woods going right up the ridge. This particular afternoon, we were down by the alders, doing our usual thing, just laughing, yelling, being kids, you know. The sounds of the woods all around, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, the creek babbling nearby. Normal, everyday sounds. Then it started. At first it was subtle, like a snapping sound, further off in the woods. We both stopped swinging, looked at each other. Probably just a branch, I said, because that's what it usually was. Wind, old trees settling, whatever. But then it happened again. Louder this time. A definite crack. Not just a branch, but like something bigger breaking. And it wasn't just one crack. It became a series of them, rapid and sharp, like someone was just tearing wood apart. We stopped swinging completely, just hanging onto the branches, listening. Then came the crashing. It wasn't like wind. It was heavier, deliberate, like something massive was moving through the trees, not caring what was in its way. Branches snapping like toothpicks, smaller trees just getting pushed aside, the deep thump of bigger trunks cracking, splitting. It was getting louder, closer. I remember looking at Eli. His eyes were wide like saucers. He was usually the brave one, always wanting to go deeper into the woods than I did, but now he looked genuinely scared. And honestly, so was I. Dad was a logger, you know, worked with heavy machinery, felled trees for a living. He taught us to respect the woods, taught us the sounds of the woods. But this wasn't like anything we'd ever heard before. This wasn't a tree falling. This was destruction, pure, raw, powerful destruction moving through the trees. The sound was getting closer fast. It was a rumble, a chaotic, violent rumble that seemed to shake the air itself. Vegetation getting torn apart, bushes being flattened. It was like a bulldozer was in the woods, but no bulldozer we ever saw sounded like that. It was organic somehow, but brutal and unstoppable. We jumped off the trees. "Eli," he whispered, voice trembling. "What is that, Caleb?" He grabbed onto my shirt, his little fingers clenching tight. I didn't know what to tell him. My mind was racing, trying to find something, anything, to explain it. A landslide? No sound of rocks. A really big animal? But what animal could make a sound like that? Like it was ripping through the forest with sheer force. Then it stopped, just stopped. As suddenly as it started, the crashing, the snapping, the rumbling, all gone, just like someone flipped a switch. Silence descended. But it wasn't a normal silence, it was heavy, thick, like the woods were holding its breath, waiting. The normal sounds, the birds chirping, the creek babbling, even those seemed quieter, muted. Everything felt tense, charged. And then, cutting through that silence, came the roar. It wasn't like any animal roar I'd ever heard. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, not even like the cattle bellowing in the pasture. It was deeper, much deeper, gut-wrenching, visceral. It started low, a rumble deep in the chest, and then built, rising in pitch and intensity, becoming this massive, ear-splitting roar. It was terrifying. Pure, unadulterated terror. It vibrated through us, through the ground, through the trees themselves. It wasn't just a sound you heard, it was something you felt deep in your bones. It resonated, it echoed, it seemed to go on forever, although it was probably only a few seconds. But in those seconds, it was like every instinct in my body screamed at me, "Danger! Run!" I didn't need to tell Eli. He was already moving. We both turned and ran, just ran. No talking, no looking back. We bolted uphill, away from the sound, towards the house. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my lungs burning, but I didn't stop. I grabbed Eli's hand, pulled him along. I could hear him gasping for breath behind me, but I just kept running. The roar, it had stopped. But the silence that followed was somehow even worse. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was an expectant silence, like something was still out there, watching, waiting. I kept glancing back over my shoulder as we ran, expecting to see, I don't know what, some huge monstrous thing crashing through the trees after us. But there was nothing, just the trees, silent and still, against the darkening afternoon sky. We burst out of the woods and into the open pasture, running as fast as we could towards the house. I could see Mom in the kitchen window, doing dishes, probably. I yelled, shouting her name, yelling for Dad. Eli and I stumbled onto the porch, practically falling through the front door. Mom was startled, turned around, saw us. Her face changed when she saw us. We must have looked, I don't know, like we'd seen a ghost. Pale, sweating, eyes wild. "Caleb, Eli, what is it? What happened?" she asked, her voice full of concern. We were both panting, too hard to speak at first. Finally, I managed to gasp out, "The woods! Something in the woods." Eli, still clinging to my shirt, just nodded, wide-eyed. Mom led us into the living room, made us sit down. She got us each a glass of water. Slow down," she said gently. "Tell me what happened. What did you see?" We tried to explain. The cracking sounds, the crashing, the rumbling, the roar. We described it as best as we could, our words tumbling over each other, disjointed, panicked. Mom listened, her brow furrowed, her expression becoming more serious as we went on. Dad came in from the garage then. He saw us, saw Mom's worried face, and he knew something was wrong. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice calm but concerned. Mom explained what we'd told her. Dad listened, his expression unchanging. He was a man of the woods, remember? He knew the sounds, he knew the animals, the weather, everything. When we finished, he was quiet for a moment, thinking. "A roar, you say?" he asked, looking at me, then at Eli. We both nodded emphatically. "Deep?" "Yeah, Dad," I said. "Really deep, like the ground was shaking." He stood up, walked to the window, looked out towards the woods. He said, rubbing his chin. "Could be a bear. Grizzly can make a racket crashing through the brush." "But Dad," Eli said, his voice still shaky, "it wasn't like a bear. It was different, bigger, and the roar. It wasn't like any animal roar I ever heard." Dad was silent again. He kept looking out the window. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, we'll check it out." "Now?" Mom asked, sounding worried. "Right now?" "No, not now," Dad said. "It's getting late. We'll go in the morning. See if we can find anything." He tried to reassure us, said it was probably just some animal, maybe a bear, maybe a deer got spooked and ran through the underbrush. He told us to calm down, that everything was fine. But I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't convinced either. He was concerned, more than he was letting on. That night, neither Eli nor I slept well. Every little noise from outside, the wind rustling the leaves, an owl hooting in the distance, made us jump. We kept thinking about that sound, that roar, and that heavy, expectant silence that followed. It was like something had come to our woods that day, something big, something powerful, something unknown. Morning came, slow and grey. After breakfast, Dad got his rifle out of the gun cabinet. Mom looked even more worried when she saw that. "Jim, do you really think you need that?" she asked. "Just in case," he said, his voice flat. "Better safe than sorry." He told us to stay at the house. He was going to go check out the woods, see what he could find. He told us to stay inside, no matter what. He meant it. His face was serious, his eyes hard. It was a look I hadn't seen very often. We watched from the window as he walked down towards the woods, rifle in hand. He disappeared into the trees, and then we waited. It felt like hours, though it was probably only an hour or so. The silence was almost unbearable. Every minute felt stretched out, filled with a tense, heavy anticipation. Finally, we saw him come back. He walked slowly, deliberately, his shoulders slumped. He didn't have the rifle raised. He didn't look like he'd seen anything. When he got to the porch, Mom ran out to meet him. "Jim, what did you find? What was it?" He shook his head slowly. "Nothing," he said. His voice was strange, hollow. "Nothing. No tracks. No broken trees. Nothing. It's like nothing ever happened." Mom looked confused, then worried again. But Caleb and Eli heard it. They said—" "I know what they said," Dad interrupted, his voice still flat. "I went down there. I walked all through those woods. There's nothing. Absolutely nothing. No sign of anything unusual." He came inside, put the rifle back in the cabinet. He looked shaken. Not scared exactly, but disturbed. Deeply disturbed. He didn't say much else that day. He just went about his chores, but he was quiet, distant, like he was wrestling with something in his own mind. We didn't go back to the alders, not for a long, long time. And even when we finally did, it wasn't the same. The woods felt different, charged, haunted almost. Every time we went near those woods, I'd find myself listening, straining to hear something, anything. But there was never anything like that again. Just the normal sounds of the woods, the wind, the birds, the creek, normal. But I never forgot it. Neither did Eli. We talked about it sometimes, years later when we were older, trying to make sense of it, trying to explain it. But we never could. Dad never spoke of it again either. It was like a closed book, something that happened, that couldn't be explained and was just left there. To this day, I have no idea what it was, what made those sounds that day in those woods, what roared like that, and what Dad found or didn't find that shook him so badly. We never saw anything, never heard anything again like it. It was just one day, one afternoon in the woods, and then gone, like it never happened, except we know it did. We were there, we heard it, we felt it, and to this day, it still chills me to the bone. The silence afterwards, most of all. That's what really gets to you. The way it just stopped and then nothing, like it just vanished into thin air. Story 5. Okay, so I don't even know where to begin with this, honestly. It's been years, decades even, and it still messes with me. People talk about being scared, about real fear, but unless you've stared into something that just shouldn't exist, you don't really get it. This was back in the 80s, way before the internet was a thing, before cell phones. We lived in North Bend, Washington. Small town, lots of trees, you know the type. Our house was on the edge of town, backing up to woods. It wasn't like deep wilderness or anything, but far enough out that it was quiet. Too quiet sometimes. My room was in the corner of the house, upstairs. It was the best room, I thought, because it had windows on two sides. One looked out over the driveway and the front yard, and the other one, that was the good one, looked out over the backyard and the woods beyond. At night, especially if there was a moon, you could see pretty far out there. We didn't have streetlights back there or anything, so it was dark, but moonlight could make everything look different. I remember this night clear as day, even though I wish I didn't. It was a full moon, like those crazy, bright full moons that make everything look silver and spooky. I woke up needing to pee, just like any normal night. I was probably 15 or 16 at the time, teenage stuff. Anyway, I sat up in bed, kinda groggy, and that's when I just saw it. I hadn't even really stood up yet. I was just sitting on the edge of my bed, rubbing my eyes a little, trying to wake up properly. My bedroom was pretty dark, just the faint glow of the moon coming in through the windows, but enough to see shapes. As my eyes adjusted a little, I glanced over towards the window that faced the woods. Just a quick look, you know. And that's when I froze. There was something out there, something big. At first, I wasn't even sure what I was seeing. It was like my brain couldn't process it properly. I thought maybe I was still half asleep, having some weird dream. But I blinked, and it was still there. It was blocking out part of the view from my window, this huge, dark shape against the moonlit trees in the distance. I sat there, completely still, just staring. It wasn't moving fast, more like drifting. It was moving along the edge of our property, parallel to the road that ran past our house, only it was in the field behind our yard. It was just massive. That's the only word for it. Massive. As it moved, it got a little closer to the window, or maybe I was just getting more awake and my eyes were focusing better. That's when the size of it really started to hit me. It was taller than the trees in the background, taller than our house even. I'm not kidding. And it wasn't like thin and wispy tall. It was bulky, solid, huge shoulders like wider than any person I'd ever seen. Like if you took a couple of those big sheets of plywood you get at the lumber yard and stacked them up. That's how wide its shoulders looked. I could see it silhouetted against the sky. The moon was behind it, which made it darker, like a shadow. But that moonlight was still strong enough to pick out the edges of it. And it wasn't just tall, it was thick. Its chest, I swear to God, looked like a tree trunk. A really thick one, like one of those old growth trees you see in pictures, except shaped like a human torso. It was humanoid in shape. Yeah, in a really basic, twisted way. It had shoulders and a chest, and I could vaguely make out what might have been arms and legs moving. But everything was just wrong. The proportions were all off. It was too tall, too wide, too thick. It was like someone had taken a human shape and just inflated it until it was grotesquely huge. And the way it moved, that was freaky too. It wasn't like walking, not like any human or animal I'd ever seen. It was like it was gliding, slowly, smoothly gliding across the ground. Its feet, or whatever they were, didn't seem to be stepping. It was more like it was just flowing across the earth, eating up ground without making a sound. I strained my ears, listening for something, anything. Usually at night you can hear crickets or maybe an owl hooting, the rustle of leaves. But there was nothing, just dead silence. The kind of silence that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on you. And in the middle of that silence, this giant thing was moving, not making a sound. It was unnatural, utterly unnatural. My heart started hammering in my chest. I felt my breath getting shallow, like I couldn't pull enough air into my lungs. My hands went clammy. I wanted to yell, to scream, but my throat just clamped shut. Fear. Real, bone-deep, paralyzing fear. That's what it was. It wasn't like being scared in a movie or when someone jumps out and scares you. This was different. This was the kind of fear that makes you freeze, makes your mind go blank. Like your body is telling you that any movement, any sound, could be the worst possible thing you could do. I just sat there, frozen, watching this thing move. It kept going, drifting along the edge of the field, getting further away from the road, moving deeper into the woods now. As it went further away, the moonlight wasn't hitting it as directly anymore, and it started to blend in with the shadows of the trees. But even as it got harder to see the shape itself, I could still sense its presence. The sheer mass of it, the size of it, it was like it warped the darkness around it. And the lack of detail, that was almost worse than if it had been some kind of monster with teeth and claws. It was just a dark silhouette, no face, no visible features, just shape. Big, dark, human-ish shape. It was faceless, like some kind of nightmare shadow come to life. It didn't need teeth or claws. Its size alone was terrifying. You just knew instinctively that whatever it was immensely powerful, beyond anything normal. I stayed glued to the window, my eyes burning, trying to follow its movements as it disappeared into the trees. I watched until I couldn't see it anymore, until the shadows swallowed it completely. But even then, even after it was gone, I couldn't move. I was still frozen solid, my muscles locked up tight. I don't know how long I sat there like that. Time just kind of stopped. Everything was just still. The silence, the darkness, the echo of that thing in my mind. I remember my teeth started chattering, not from cold, but from pure, unadulterated terror. I was shaking, but I couldn't stop. It was like my body was still trying to run, even though I hadn't moved an inch. Slowly, gradually, the paralysis started to wear off. My breathing started to get a little deeper. I could feel my fingers again. I still didn't want to move. I was terrified that if I moved, if I made any noise, it would come back, that it was still out there, somewhere in the woods, just waiting. But eventually, the need to pee got too strong to ignore. It was a tiny, stupid human need in the face of something so utterly beyond human comprehension. But it was enough to break the spell a little. Carefully, slowly, I got off the bed. My legs were stiff and shaky. I felt like I was walking on jelly. I crept across the room, keeping my eyes fixed on the window, just in case it somehow came back. I made it to the door and slipped out into the hallway. The house was quiet, everyone else asleep. I didn't want to wake anyone up. What could I even say? Hey, I just saw a monster the size of a house in the backyard. Who would believe me? They'd think I was crazy or having a nightmare. And maybe I was. Maybe it was just a really vivid dream. But it felt so real, too real. I went to the bathroom, did my business, washed my hands. Everything felt surreal, like I was moving through a dream still. I looked at myself in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide and dark. I looked like I'd seen a ghost, or something much, much worse. When I went back to my room, I didn't go back to bed right away. I stood by the window again, looking out at the woods. It was still dark, but the moon was starting to set. The light was fading a little. Everything looked normal. Just trees, shadows, quiet night. There was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. No giant shadows, no silent gliders. Nothing. I waited there for a long time, watching, listening, just in case. But nothing happened. The night stayed quiet. Slowly, very slowly, the sky started to get lighter in the east. Dawn was coming. The first hint of grey started to creep over the horizon, chasing away the darkness. As the light grew, the fear started to recede, just a little. The world started to look normal again. Safe. The woods were just trees. The shadows were just shadows. Whatever I had seen, it felt like it had been banished by the coming of the sun, like it was something that could only exist in the dark, something that daylight couldn't touch. By the time the sun actually came up, painting the sky pink and gold, I felt drained, exhausted, but also weirdly empty, like something had been sucked out of me, leaving me hollow. I went back to bed then, finally, but I didn't sleep. Not really. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling. The images of that thing burned into my mind. I've never told anyone about this, not really. How do you? It sounds insane. And part of me, even now, wonders if I did just imagine it. If it was some trick of the light, some waking nightmare. But I know what I saw. I felt the fear. And I know, deep down, that something was out there that night. Something huge, something dark, something impossible. And it was real. I swear it was real. The sun came up. The day went on. And everything seemed normal again. Breakfast, school, homework. Life went back to its regular rhythm. But for me, something had changed. The world felt different, less solid. Like there were things hiding just outside of normal sight, just beyond the edge of what we understand. Things that were vast and unknowable and terrifying. And sometimes, late at night, when the moon is full and bright and the house is quiet, I still find myself looking out the window, just checking, just in case, and I hate myself for it, but I can't stop. Because even after all these years, I still remember the feeling of that silence, that cold, paralyzing fear, and the sight of that impossible shape against the moonlit sky. And I know in some corner of my mind that it could happen again. that it could be out there still, waiting for the dark. Story 6. We picked a spot, cleared the leaves, got a good fire going. Smelled like pine and wood smoke, that real comforting smell of the woods. We ate some jerky, split a can of beans. Simple food, but after a hard day it tasted like a feast. We talked a bit about the day's work, how many cords we'd managed, the price of lumber, that kind of thing. The fire was popping, throwing sparks up into the darkness, pushing back the edges of the night a little. But as the light from the fire danced around, stretching and shrinking the shadows, I started feeling this prickle. Not cold, not exactly fear, more like when you know someone's watching you, even if you can't see them. I've been in the woods my whole life. You get a sense for these things, a feeling in the gut. Animals will do that to you, even unseen. But this felt different, heavier, almost like it wasn't animal. I didn't say anything to Silas at first. Didn't want to sound like some spooked kid. He was leaned back against a log, chewing on a twig, eyes half closed, enjoying the quiet. But the feeling just kept getting stronger, like something was drilling holes in the back of my neck. I started glancing around, slow and casual, trying not to make it obvious, just scanning the tree line, the deeper shadows beyond the firelight. Nothing, just trees, brush, darkness, the usual. But the feeling, it was insistent. It was like the air itself was holding its breath. The usual night sound seemed quieter, muted. Even the crackling of the fire didn't seem to cut through the stillness as much. I kept thinking, maybe it's just my nerves, a long day getting to me, but that didn't feel right either. I knew this feeling, it was too sharp, too real. And then I saw it. Just a flicker in my peripheral vision at first, a deeper shadow moving in the shadows. Like a trick of the eye, maybe just leaves shifting in a breeze, even though there wasn't any breeze. But it caught my attention, pulled my gaze that way. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head. And there it was, standing at the edge of the firelight, just where the darkness started to swallow everything whole. It was big. I mean really big. Bigger than any man I'd ever seen. Bigger even than most bears I'd come across. It was just a silhouette at first, mostly black against the dark trees, but as my eyes adjusted, as the firelight flickered, I started to make out shapes, long arms hanging down, almost to its knees, a thick, hunched back, a head that seemed set right on its shoulders, no real neck to speak of, and hair, dark, thick hair covering it all. It was standing upright like a man, but not quite. More like ape-like, the way it held itself. But it was too tall, too massive to be an ape. And those arms, they were long and heavy, like they could snap a tree trunk. It wasn't moving, just standing there, still as a statue, watching us. My breath caught in my throat. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I wanted to yell, to shout, but my voice just seemed stuck. Silas was still leaned back, not noticing anything. He was always a bit slower to pick up on things, more relaxed, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. Couldn't move. Then it turned its head, just a slow turn like it was curious, or maybe just making sure it had a good look. And that's when I saw its face, or what I could make out of it in the dim light. It was mostly hidden in shadow, but I could see the shape, the outline. It wasn't animal, not like any animal I knew. It was almost human, but wrong, distorted. Something about the brow, the way the features were set. It just didn't look right. And then I saw its eyes, 2 points of deep, dark black in the shadowed face. They were looking right at me, just staring, not threatening, not aggressive, but intense, like they were seeing right through me, peeling back layers I didn't even know I had. It was like being pinned in place by those eyes, held there against my will. We locked eyes. For how long, I don't know. Felt like forever. The fire crackled, the woods stayed silent, and we just stared at each other across that thin line of firelight. I don't think I even blinked. Then something changed. Maybe it was the sudden snap of a burning log in the fire. Maybe it was just a shift in the air. I don't know. But it was like the spell broke. It flinched. Just a slight jerk. A reaction. Like it was surprised I'd seen it. Or surprised that I was looking back. And in a heartbeat it was gone. Just gone. 1 second it was there. A hulking shadow at the edge of the light. The next second, just empty darkness. It didn't run, didn't crash through the underbrush. It just vanished, like it had stepped behind a curtain or been swallowed by the night itself. I blinked. I gasped for air. My whole body was tense, wired tight as a drum. I turned to Silas, my voice finally working, but it came out raspy, strained. "Silas," I said, louder than I meant to. "Silas, did you see that?" He startled, blinked a few times, looked around, confused. "See what, Jed? What's wrong with you? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Back there," I said, pointing to where it had been, my hand shaking. "In the shadows. Did you see something?" He frowned, squinted into the darkness. "See what? Just shadows, Jed. You're jumpy tonight. Must be them ghost stories old man Hemlock was telling us at the mill again." He chuckled a little, trying to make light of it. "No, Silas," I said, my voice stronger now, more insistent. "I'm serious. There was something there, big, standing in the woods, watching us." He sat up straighter now, finally taking me seriously. He knew I wasn't one to imagine things, not in the woods. "What are you talking about? A bear? Mountain lion?" "No," I said, "not an animal, not like that. It was, I don't know what it was, but it was big and it was standing upright, like a man, but different." Silas looked at me, really looked at me. He could see I wasn't joking. He knew I was shaken. He finally got up, his hand going to the axe leaning against the log, just a precaution, I guess. "All right," he said, his voice quiet now. "Show me." I got up too, still feeling that cold dread crawling through me. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire, using it like a torch. Silas did the same. We held them high, pushing back the darkness a little, and stepped cautiously towards the tree line, towards where I'd seen it. The ground was just dirt and leaves right around the fire, but a few steps into the trees, we hit a patch of snow, left over from a late spring storm, packed down hard in the shade. The firelight from our torches flickered across the white surface, throwing long, dancing shadows of the trees. We moved slowly, scanning the ground, the trees, the deeper shadows. Nothing. Just the woods, silent and still. Silas was starting to look skeptical again, like he thought I'd just imagined the whole thing. I was starting to wonder myself, just for a second. Maybe it was just the firelight playing tricks, shadows moving in a weird way, my mind tired and jumpy. But then I saw it. Just ahead, in the patch of snow, clear as day. A footprint, but not just any footprint. This was huge. Way bigger than any human footprint, bigger than any bear track, any deer track, anything I'd ever seen in the woods. It was a single print, clear and deep in the snow. A heel print. Just a heel. But it was enormous. I held the torch closer. Silas did too. We stared at it, not saying anything for a moment. It was shaped like a human heel, you could see that. But it was at least twice the size of my boot, maybe even bigger. And deep, like whatever made it was incredibly heavy. The edges were crisp, like it had been made just moments ago, and there was only one, just the one heel print in the snow, pointing away from our camp towards the ridge that rose up behind us, like whatever made it had been standing there, just at the edge of the snow, watching us by the fire, and then stepped back and moved away, uphill, over the ridge, deliberately avoiding the snow except for that one step. I looked at Silas, and he looked at me. His eyes were wide now, no more skepticism in them. He was seeing it too. We both knew what this meant. It wasn't an animal, not any animal we knew, and it wasn't human, not in the way we understood it. We followed the direction of the print towards the ridge. The snow patch ended soon after that one print. After that, just leaves and dirt again. Hard to see anything. We pushed a little further, our torches casting weak circles of light in the darkness, but we didn't find anything else. No more prints, no broken branches, no sound, nothing. Just the deep, silent woods. We went back to the fire then. The mood had shifted completely. The comfortable quiet of the evening was gone, replaced by a tense, uneasy silence. We sat back down, staring into the flames, but now they didn't feel warm or comforting. They just seemed to throw more shadows, make the darkness outside the circle of light seem deeper, more menacing. We didn't talk much after that. What was there to say? We both knew what we'd seen, or at least what we'd sensed. And we'd seen that print. There was no explaining it away. It was real. Something was out there, in those woods. Something big, something different, something that watched us from the shadows. We kept the fire burning high that night, piling on wood until the flames were roaring. We took turns staying awake, watching the tree line, listening to every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed to carry a hidden meaning. We didn't sleep much. When the first hint of dawn finally started to break, painting the sky a pale grey, it was like a weight lifted off our chests. The darkness seemed less menacing in the growing light. The woods didn't feel quite as watchful. We packed up camp quickly, didn't even bother with breakfast. We just wanted to get out of there, back to town, back to people, back to the known world. As we walked out of those woods, back towards Oakhaven, I kept looking back over my shoulder, half expecting to see something, some dark shape watching us from the trees. But there was nothing, just the woods, silent and still, holding their secrets. We never talked about it much after that. Not really. We knew what we'd experienced. We knew what we'd seen, or what we hadn't seen, but felt. And that footprint, that huge solitary heel print in the snow, it was enough. We didn't need to talk it to death. Some things are better left unspoken, undigested. To this day, I can still see those dark eyes staring out of the shadow, feel that prickling unease on the back of my neck. And I still think about that print, that single, impossibly large heel in the snow. I've spent my whole life in these woods, but I've never understood what we saw that night. And I don't think I ever will. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there watching, waiting in the shadows just beyond the firelight. And that thought still chills me to the bone. Story 7. It happened back in '59. Whispering Isles off Evergreener. Beautiful place, they say. Desolate is what I remember. I was a mariner, though recluse might be closer to the truth. Used to charter my boat out, mostly for hunting trips around those islands. Solitude was what I craved. Bad business to crave solitude in my line of work, I know. But there you have it. Anyway, I'd just finished a deer hunt on this island. Sable Island, they called it. Part of the Whispering Isles chain. Not much to it, Sable. Just sand and scrub, really. Beautiful in a bleak sort of way, if you like that sort of thing. I didn't hate it. It was early morning, pale light just hitting the sand. Had myself a decent buck, good size. Dragged it down towards the shore, waiting for my chartered vessel to arrive and pick me up. Was supposed to be there any time around dawn. I figured I'd have a fire going, maybe even cook some fresh venison while I waited. Seemed peaceful enough then. The air was crisp, salty like you'd expect. Typical island morning. Then this smell. It hit me suddenly, knocked me back like a wave. Acrid, musky, foul, but not like rotten meat, if that makes sense. Worse, like something primal, animal, but wrong, completely unnatural. It burned in my nostrils, made my eyes water. I've smelled plenty of things in my life at sea, you understand. Dead fish, oil spills, you name it. Never smelled anything like this. It wasn't just unpleasant, it was alarming. I stopped dragging the deer, stood up straight, nose twitching, trying to figure out where it was coming from. Wind was coming off the land, light breeze. It was definitely coming from the island itself, not the sea. My gut clenched. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. I turned, slow at first, then faster, towards the thick scrub and tangled trees behind the beach. Figured maybe some kind of animal, a boar or something. Though Whispering Isles weren't known for boars. And that smell, it was too intense for a boar. Way too intense. And then I saw it. God in heaven, I wish I hadn't. I honestly wish I could scrub the image from my mind. It's there, burnt in, even now, years later. Still wakes me up sometimes in a cold sweat. It was lumbering out of the thicket. Lumbering is the only word that fits, really. Slow, clumsy almost, but still powerful, huge, taller than any man, easily. And grotesque doesn't even begin to cover it. The form, it was vaguely humanoid, in a stretched, twisted kind of way. But everything was wrong. Wrong proportions, wrong texture. The skin, God, the skin. It was like parchment, maybe? Pale, sickly yellow-grey, stretched tight over something underneath that wasn't human bone and muscle. It looked damp, slick in the morning light, like it had been marinating in something foul. Patches of dark, wet fur or matted hair clung to parts of it, like mold on old bread. Its limbs were too long, too spindly, bent at angles that didn't seem natural. The hands, they weren't hands, more like claws, long, curved, black, tipped with something sharp and shiny, like polished obsidian. They scraped against the ground as it moved, making this horrible grating sound. And the head, buried low between its shoulders, like it had no neck, barely any neck at all. And the face, what I could see of it, because it was mostly hidden in shadow under this fleshy brow ridge. It was a mess. Mushed together features, like someone had tried to sculpt a human face in clay and then just smashed it with a fist. Two dark holes where eyes should be, reflecting no light, just emptiness, and a slit for a mouth hanging open, drooling, some kind of thick, dark fluid. The smell was coming from it. It was oozing out of it. I froze, solid, absolute terror. My blood turned to ice. Every instinct in my body screamed at me. Run, get away, survive. I didn't even think, didn't plan, just reacted. Dropped the deer carcass right there on the sand. Didn't even glance back, just spun around and bolted for the sea. The frigid water hit me like a physical blow. Didn't stop, didn't hesitate. Plunged in, clothes and all. Waded, then swam through the icy waves, scrambling, kicking, fighting my way out. The water was shocking, stealing my breath, but I didn't care. Anything was better than staying on that beach with that thing. Out in the water, I saw a small rocky islet. Not much, just a cluster of rocks poking out, maybe 20-30 yards offshore. Hope surged through the terror, made for it. Every stroke felt like an eternity, lungs burning, muscles screaming from the cold. But I kept going, had to keep going. Finally reached the islet, stumbled onto the slick, seaweed-covered rocks, hands raw from the rough surface. Pulled myself up, collapsed behind the largest boulder, panting, shivering uncontrollably. Looked back towards the beach. Heart hammering against my ribs like it wanted to break free, vision blurring, half from the cold, half from the sheer terror of it. I could still smell it, that awful, cloying stench, even out here on the islet. But fainter, much fainter, peered cautiously around the boulder. The beach was empty, just sand and scrub and the abandoned deer carcass lying there stark against the pale sand. And nothing. No sign of the creature. Had it gone back into the woods? Had it even seen me? Or was it watching, hiding, waiting? The thought made my skin crawl. I stayed crouched behind the rocks, trying to breathe, trying to calm down, but my body was shaking too hard to stop. Time seemed to warp and stretch. Minutes felt like hours. I just huddled there, a shivering mess of fear and cold, eyes glued to the beach, scanning every shadow, every bush, every tree line. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The light got stronger. The cold seeped deeper into my bones. Still, nothing. Just the empty beach and the silent scrubland behind it. The stench seemed to have faded too, or maybe I was just getting used to it. Hard to tell. Dared to hope after a while. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it was just some nightmare hallucination. The isolation, the fatigue. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But the deer carcass was still there, and the smell had been real. Too real. And the terror, that was real too. That was burned into my soul, waited longer, another eternity it felt like. Sun was almost overhead now, still no sign of my charter boat. Damned boat was late. Or maybe they weren't coming at all. Maybe I was stranded here, on this island, with whatever that thing was. Desperation started to set in. Couldn't stay on this islet forever. No food, no water. And if that creature was still around, it would find me eventually. I knew it would. That certainty was worse than the fear, almost. Started looking around the islet for anything I could use. Found a piece of driftwood, washed up between the rocks. Not much. Rough, splintered, but maybe enough. Heart pounding again, a sick, heavy thudding in my chest. Made a decision. Had to go back. Had to get back to the beach. Had to get off this island. Slowly, carefully, pushed the driftwood into the water. Used it as a makeshift paddle. It was clumsy, awkward, barely moved me at all. But inch by agonizing inch, I started to make my way back towards Sable Island. The water was still bone-chilling, but I barely noticed it now. Numbness had set in, both physical and mental. Reached the beach again, felt like I was crawling back into a nightmare. Dragged myself out of the water onto the sand, listened, held my breath. Every nerve in my body screaming, waiting for something to jump out, to grab me, to drag me back into the dark. Silence. Just the sound of the waves, the wind in the scrub, and birds. Seagulls circling overhead, drawn to the deer carcass. They hadn't touched it yet, though. Too wary, maybe. Or maybe even they could smell something wrong. Stumbled towards the deer, heavy. Had to drag it again. Started hauling it further up the beach, away from the water's edge, towards where I'd left my gear. Movement felt slow, labored. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. Looking over my shoulder every few seconds, expecting to see that thing lurching out of the trees again. Reached my gear. My pack, my rifle, thankfully still there, untouched. Rifle. Had completely forgotten about the rifle in the panic. Grabbed it now, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady. Loaded it clumsily, fumbling with the cartridges. The cold had made my fingers stiff, clumsy. Held the rifle tight, feeling the weight of it in my hands, a small measure of comfort, a pathetic shield against whatever lurked in the shadows. Started moving along the beach, keeping close to the water's edge, scanning the tree line, every shadow, every shape. Still smelled it, faintly, lingering in the air, a ghost of that awful stench, proof that it had been real, proof that it was still somewhere. Walked for what felt like hours, just kept walking, just kept looking, waiting, dreading, each step an effort, each breath a shallow, ragged gasp. The beauty of the whispering isles gone, erased, replaced by a cold, gnawing dread. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to move, to shift, to take shape. Knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was still watching me. Somewhere out there in the scrub behind the trees, waiting. Or maybe it was closer than that. Maybe it was already closer than I knew. Never saw it again. Not that day. Not ever. My charter vessel finally arrived, hours late, thank God. Climbed aboard, didn't say a word to the crew, just collapsed in the cabin, rifle still clutched in my hands. Sailed away from Sable Island, away from the Whispering Isles. Didn't look back. Haven't been back since. Wouldn't go back if you paid me. Some places are just tainted. Something wrong there. Something ancient, something evil. And that smell. I still smell it sometimes in my dreams. That acrid, musky, unnatural stench. And then I see it again. that grotesque form lumbering out of the trees. And the terror comes flooding back, just as raw, just as real as it was that day on Sable Island. And I know even now that it's still out there, somewhere in the Whispering Isles, lurking, waiting. And I can't explain it, can't understand it, just know. Some things you just can't explain, some things you just have to live with. And the Whispering Isles, they whisper now to me of only dread. Story 8. It was supposed to be peaceful. Labor Day weekend, 1959. Gareth and I, we loved getting out to the Nerby Highlands. Hinnon Lake was our spot, always quiet, especially that far in. 5 days we'd been out there already, just soaking it in. You know, real camping. No radios, no cars honking, just the woods, the lake, and us. Everything was perfect. We'd hiked, fished a bit, mostly just relaxed, read books by the water, cooked over the fire. Pure bliss, honestly. Then came that last evening. Dusk was settling, the kind that paints the sky all these unbelievable shades of orange and purple, like someone spilled paint everywhere. I told Gareth I was going to grab a bit more firewood. We were down to scraps, and it was going to get cold fast. The sun was dipping behind the trees already, and that mountain air gets chilly the second the light goes. I stepped out of the tent. We had it set up in a little clearing, pretty standard. Just enough space for the tent, a fire pit we'd dug, and our supplies off to the side under a tarp. Everything was familiar, comfortable. I'd been in these woods 100 times, felt as at home there as in our little place in Bellevue. That's why what happened. It just doesn't make any sense still. I started walking towards where we'd seen some fallen branches earlier, just past this little rise, maybe 50 feet from the tent. There was this one lone pine tree on top of it, kinda skinny but tall, and the ground around it sloped up gently. As I got closer to the rise, that feeling hit me. You know the one? Like when someone's staring at the back of your neck and you just know it. It's like a physical chill, but it starts inside, like ice water running through your veins. I stopped walking, dead still. My heart started pounding in my chest, way too fast, like it was trying to escape. I told myself it was just the woods, the shadows getting longer, playing tricks on my mind. Deer, probably, or maybe a raccoon. We'd seen both around earlier in the week, nothing to be scared of, but this wasn't just being startled by a twig snapping. This was different, heavier, wrong. I slowly turned my head, trying to scan the tree line without making any sudden moves. Nothing, just trees, bushes, the fading light filtering through the leaves. I told myself I was being ridiculous. City nerves, that's all. Deep breath, Ilara. It's just the woods. I took another step forward, and that feeling doubled. It was like the air itself got thicker, colder. My skin prickled all over, and the hair on my arms stood straight up. I felt like I was being pinned in place, like something was holding me there, and then I saw it. It was on that little rise behind that pine tree, just like I'd thought. But it wasn't a deer, it wasn't a raccoon. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen or even imagined seeing in my entire life. It was tall. God, it was tall. Even partially hidden behind that tree, it towered over it. I'd guess easily over 6 feet, maybe even 7. And it wasn't like a man standing tall. It was just massive, broad-shouldered, thick, everything. It was hard to make out details at first. The light was fading fast, and it was partially in shadow, that tree kind of blocking it. But the first thing that hit me was the hair. It was everywhere. Coarse, matted-looking hair, a dark, rust color, like dried blood almost. It covered its whole body, or what I could see of it, except for parts of its face, which were different. As my eyes adjusted, or maybe as it moved slightly, I could make out more. The hair seemed to thin out around its chest and stomach, becoming a lighter, almost sandy brown color in patches. But on its arms and legs, and especially its back and shoulders, it was thick and dark. And then there was the face. That's what I keep seeing when I close my eyes. Its face was flat, like someone had taken a human face and just pressed it flat with their hand. It was partially bare, meaning there wasn't hair all over it like the rest of its body, but it wasn't smooth skin either. It looked rough, leathery, and pale. Paler than I'd ever seen any person, like bleached bone. Its forehead sloped back sharply, no real brow ridge like you'd expect. And its nose. There wasn't one, not really. Just a flat expanse of that pale skin with two dark holes punched into it, like nostrils but wrong. Too far apart, too deep set. And the mouth. Just a slit. A thin, straight line, no lips to speak of. It was just a gash in that flat face. And dark, so dark inside. It was like looking into nothing. It was just standing there, perfectly still, behind that pine tree. But it was facing me. I knew it was looking at me. I could feel it. Even though its eyes were in shadow, I could feel them boring into me. It was watching me. There's no other word for it. It was just watching. And it was intense, predatory, like I was prey and it was sizing me up. And I swear in that moment I wasn't just scared. I was terrified in a way I'd never been before. It wasn't like being scared of a bear or a snake. This was primal fear. Fear of something unknown, something fundamentally wrong. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My legs felt like lead. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my body just wouldn't respond. I was frozen, locked in place by, what? Fear? Or something else? It didn't make a sound. Didn't move a muscle as far as I could tell. It just stood there, watching me with that flat face, those dark holes, that slit of a mouth, and the hair, that rust-colored, matted hair. It all swam in my vision, slowly, so slowly it felt like time was stretching. I started to back away, one step at a time, keeping my eyes locked on it. I didn't want to turn my back, didn't want to give it, whatever it was, the chance to what? I didn't even know. But I knew I needed to get away. Each step was agony. My muscles were screaming, my heart was hammering, and I was pretty sure I'd stop breathing entirely. I just kept backing up inch by agonizing inch, my eyes glued to that shape behind the pine tree. It didn't follow me. It just stayed there, watching. I finally reached the edge of our clearing. I could see the tent, just a few feet away. The fire pit, still faintly glowing, was to my left. I didn't dare take my eyes off that thing to look properly, but I could sense Gareth inside the tent. Probably reading, totally oblivious. I backed up another few steps, and then finally I allowed myself to turn. I scrambled, stumbling, the fear lending me a desperate, frantic energy. I practically threw myself into the tent, fumbling with the zipper, pulling it closed behind me like it was a fortress wall. Gareth looked up, startled. He had his book in his lap, a small lantern casting a warm glow inside the tent. "Ilara, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." He chuckled a little, but the sound died in his throat as he saw my face. I was shaking so badly I could barely speak. My teeth were chattering, and my whole body felt clammy with cold sweat. I pointed back in the direction of the woods, towards the rise. There was something out there. My voice was just a shaky whisper. Gareth was instantly alert. He sat up straight, his eyes widening. "What do you mean, something? A bear? Did you see a bear?" He started to reach for the flashlight we kept by the tent flap. "No, not a bear." I swallowed hard, trying to get my voice to work properly. I don't know what it was. It was big, tall, covered in hair, and its face. I shuddered, the image flashing back into my mind. Gareth, it was horrible. He was looking at me, really seeing my fear. Gareth wasn't easily rattled. He was practical, calm in a crisis. But he could see I was genuinely terrified. And that scared him too, I think. He put the flashlight down slowly. "Okay," he said, his voice low and serious. "Okay, Ilara, take a breath. Tell me exactly what you saw. Calmly." I tried to. I described it as best I could. The size, the hair, the flat face, the nostrils, the slit mouth, the way it just stood there watching. I told him about the feeling of being watched, the cold, the primal fear. As I spoke, my voice got steadier, but the fear didn't lessen. If anything, just putting the words to it made it feel even more real, more terrifying. Gareth listened in silence, his brow furrowed, his eyes fixed on mine. When I finished, he didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stared at me, his face pale in the lantern light. Finally he spoke, and what he said, it chilled me to the bone even more than what I'd seen. "Ilara," he said slowly, "last night I had this dream, a really strange dream. I woke up in the middle of the night and I just couldn't shake it. I didn't tell you this morning because, I don't know, it just seemed silly. But in my dream..." He hesitated, then continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "In my dream, I felt like we shouldn't be here. Like we needed to leave. Tomorrow. Early. I had this really strong feeling that we weren't safe here anymore." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "And now you tell me this. About that thing. Out there." He gestured towards the woods with his head. "Ilara, I think we need to pack up. Now. Tonight." I didn't argue. Not for a second. The thought of staying there, even for another hour, was unbearable. My fear was still a living thing inside me, cold and sharp. Gareth's dream, combined with what I'd seen, it felt like a sign, like a warning. We had to get out. We moved fast, adrenaline and fear pumping through us. We blew out the lantern, doused the fire pit with water, and started tearing down the tent in the dark. We packed everything back into our packs as quickly and quietly as we could, our movements hushed, our senses straining for any sound from outside the tent. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made us jump. We kept glancing nervously towards the trees, our hearts hammering in our chests. The night felt thick with unseen things, with silent watchers. The peaceful woods of the past 5 days had become alien and menacing in an instant. It was hard to pack in the dark, using just the faint glow of the moon filtering through the trees. But we managed. We worked in a silent, frantic rhythm, driven by the urgent need to escape. Finally, everything was packed. We had our packs on, the tent and all our gear stuffed inside. We stood there for a moment in the darkness of our cleared campsite, listening. The woods were silent, too silent. The usual night sounds, crickets, owls, seemed to have gone quiet. It was like everything was holding its breath. Then we heard it. From the direction of the rise, where I'd seen that thing, a sound, not a shout, not a roar, something lower, heavier, like heavy footsteps, but not human footsteps. Too heavy, too deliberate, and dragging almost. Like something immensely heavy was moving through the undergrowth. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried in the still night air. It was unmistakable. It was coming closer, slowly, steadily, coming from the trees towards where our camp had been. We didn't wait to hear any more. We turned and ran, not even bothering to be quiet now. Just ran. Away from the sound, away from the campsite, away from Hinnon Lake, back down the trail towards the main road, towards safety, towards anything that wasn't those woods. We ran until our lungs burned, our legs ached, and our sides were stitched tight. We didn't stop running until we were out of the trees, onto the logging road that led back to the highway. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, parked at the trailhead a mile back. We collapsed into the car, breathless and shaking, locking the doors before Gareth even started the engine. We didn't speak. We just sat there for a moment, gasping for air, listening to the pounding of our own hearts, the silence of the car a blessed relief after the oppressive quiet of the woods. Gareth started the car. He put it in gear and drove fast, down that logging road, back towards civilization, back towards light and noise and other people. We didn't look back. We drove all the way back to Bellevue that night. Didn't stop. didn't speak much, just drove, our minds filled with the images and sounds of that night, the feeling of cold dread still clinging to us like a shroud. We never went back to Hinnon Lake, never went camping in the Njurby Highlands again, and we never talked about it, not really. We'd mention it sometimes in hushed tones late at night, but we never dug into it, never tried to explain it, because there is no explanation. To this day, I don't know what I saw that evening, what that thing was, standing on that rise behind the pine tree, watching me with those flat features and dark holes for eyes. I just know it was real. I know I saw it. And I know that feeling of dread, that primal fear, it's still with me. Even now, all these years later. Sometimes, when it's quiet and the light starts to fade, I still feel it. That icy chill, that sense of being watched. And I see that face, flat and pale, with its slit of a mouth and those dark, empty eyes. And I know deep down that something out there saw us too, and it didn't want us there. Story 9. Look, I don't usually do this kind of thing, posting online about stuff like this. But I saw a thread about unexplained things in the woods, and it just brought it all back like a punch to the gut. And honestly, I haven't really talked about it properly to anyone since it happened. Not really. People would just look at you funny, you know? It was late fall, 59, Clinton, Lillooet. Back then, it was even more remote than it is now. Beautiful place, don't get me wrong, especially that time of year when the leaves are turning and the air gets that real bite to it. But secluded, real secluded. I'd been hunting those woods my whole life, practically. My dad taught me everything I knew, and his dad before him. I knew every deer trail, every good spot for rabbits, where the squirrels nested. Thought I knew it like the back of my hand. Turns out, I didn't know squat. That day, it was colder than I expected. Early November cold. There was already a dusting of snow on the ground, especially in the deeper woods, where the sun didn't really reach. Crunchy underfoot, that kind of snow that makes every step echo. I was out for deer, hoping to fill the freezer before the real winter set in. Had my old Winchester, the one my dad passed down. Felt comfortable with it in my hands, like an extension of myself. I'd been walking for a couple of hours, deeper into the woods than usual. Wasn't having much luck, to be honest. Saw a few tracks, but nothing fresh. The air was still, almost too still, you know? That kind of quiet that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up a bit. Too quiet. Even the birds were keeping their mouths shut. I was pushing through a thick patch of pines, the needles scratching at my jacket, when I saw it. At first, I didn't know what I was looking at. It was behind this huge old stump, a real monster, the kind that's been there for 100 years. The base of it was thick, gnarled roots spreading out all over, half buried in the snow. And right there, poking out from behind the stump, was, well, legs. That's the only way I can describe them. Legs. But not like any legs I'd ever seen before. They were massive, thicker than any man's legs, thicker than a bear's even. And they were hairy. Not like human hair or even animal fur, but coarse, bristly hair, kind of yellowish-brown in color, like old straw gone bad. They were just sticking out there from behind the base of the stump, maybe a couple of feet, from the knee down, I guess. I couldn't see higher than that because of the stump. My first thought wasn't even, what is that? It was pure, gut-wrenching fear, like something primal just took over. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to get the hell away from whatever those things were attached to. I froze, solid, right there in the snow. My heart started hammering in my chest, so hard I could hear it pounding in my ears. My breath caught in my throat. I remember I was holding my rifle, and my hands were suddenly slick with sweat, even though it was freezing cold. I just stood there, staring at these legs. They weren't moving, still as stone. But the stillness was somehow even more terrifying, like whatever they belonged to was waiting, watching. I could feel it, this cold dread creeping up my spine. It wasn't just fear of the unknown, it was deeper than that. It was like something ancient and wrong. Hunting instincts, forget about it. All that training, all those years in the woods, went right out the window. There was no hunting anything in that moment. Just pure, raw fear. I didn't even dare breathe too loud. I felt like if I made any noise at all, whatever those legs were connected to would turn and what? I didn't want to know. I slowly started backing away. Like you would if you were sneaking up on a spooked deer, except this was 1,000 times worse. Every crunch of snow under my boots felt deafening in the silence. I kept my eyes locked on those legs, not daring to look away, just backed up, inch by agonizing inch, until I was behind a screen of pine trees. And then I ran. Not like a jog, not like a brisk walk. I bolted, like something was chasing me. Branches whipped at my face, snow sprayed up from my boots, and I didn't stop running until I was a good mile away, panting, heart still pounding like a drum solo. I leaned against a tree, gasping for air, trying to get my bearings. The rational part of my brain, the part that was trying to claw its way back through the fear, was screaming at me to go back, to figure out what it was, to be a man and face it. But the other part, the deeper part, was still screaming, run. And honestly, that's what I wanted to do. Keep running and never stop. I sat there for a while, trying to calm down. The sun was getting lower in the sky. I knew I should probably be heading back home. But those legs, they were stuck in my head, playing over and over like a broken record. I kept trying to make sense of it, to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear? But bears don't have legs like that. Not that thick, not that hairy, not that color. And bears don't just stick their legs out from behind stumps. Maybe it was a moose, somehow contorted at a weird angle. But moose legs are different too. And again, the hair, the color, it didn't match anything I knew. Nothing living, anyway. It looked prehistoric, like something out of a book about dinosaurs, except those weren't hairy, were they? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. And the less sense it made, the more that nagging curiosity started to creep in. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch. I told myself I had to go back, just to take another look, just to see if I could figure it out. Maybe I was just seeing things. Maybe the cold was getting to me. It was stupid, I know. In hindsight, unbelievably stupid. But I'm a hunter. Curiosity is part of it, I guess. And a bit of pride too, maybe. Not wanting to be scared off by something I couldn't explain. So, after what felt like hours, but was probably only an hour or so, I started heading back. This time, I was a lot slower, and a lot more scared. I kept my rifle loaded and ready, thumb on the safety. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. The woods seemed different now, darker, more menacing. It wasn't just the fading light. It was like something had changed in the atmosphere itself. Something heavy, something watchful. When I got back to the area where I'd seen the stump, my heart started pounding again. I approached slowly, cautiously, rifle raised. The stump was still there, massive and ancient. The snow around it was undisturbed. And the legs, they were gone. Gone. Just gone. Like they'd vanished into thin air. Relief flooded through me, so strong it almost made me weak in the knees. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I'd been spooked by nothing. I started to laugh a little, a shaky, nervous laugh. Idiot, I muttered to myself. Scared by nothing. But then I saw the tracks. In the snow around the stump, leading away from it, were footprints. Gigantic footprints. Nothing like deer tracks, or bear tracks, or anything I'd ever seen in the woods. They were huge, maybe 15, 16 inches long and wide, like they belonged to something incredibly heavy. They weren't shaped exactly like human footprints, but they were close. More elongated, maybe. And three-toed. I distinctly remember seeing 3 toes in the snow. They were deep tracks, pressed down into the snow and the dirt underneath, like something with immense weight had been walking there. And the stride was unnatural. longer than any human stride, even when running. Whatever made these tracks, it moved with a power I couldn't even imagine, and they were headed away from the stump, leading deeper into the woods, towards the ravine. There's a ravine not too far from that spot, deep, rocky, overgrown with trees and brush, a place where even sunlight struggles to reach, a dark, hidden place. And these tracks were leading straight for it. Curiosity, or maybe just plain foolishness, took over again. I had to see where they went. I started following the tracks, rifle still raised, eyes scanning the woods around me, every sense on high alert. The tracks were easy to follow in the snow, even as the light continued to fade. They were so deep, so distinct. The woods grew darker, colder, the closer I got to the ravine. The trees seemed to close in around me. The shadows lengthened and twisted into strange shapes. The silence was back, heavier than before, pressing down on me like a physical weight. It felt like I was walking into a place I wasn't supposed to be. And then I reached the edge of the ravine. The tracks led right to the edge, to the very lip of the drop-off. And then they stopped. Just stopped. Abruptly. Like whatever had made them had stepped right off the edge and vanished. There were no tracks going down into the ravine, no tracks coming back out, just tracks leading to the edge, and then nothing. I stood there, at the edge of that ravine, in the fading light, staring down into the shadows below. The air was ice cold, still and dead, and I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach that those tracks weren't just leading somewhere. They were leading away from something, away from that stump, away from me, away from something hidden in the woods, and it had been right there, hidden behind that stump, just waiting, and I had stumbled right upon it, and then it had left for the ravine. But it hadn't gone into the ravine. It had just vanished at the edge. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, staring into the darkness of that ravine. The last bit of light drained from the sky. The woods became completely silent, completely black. And the fear came back, stronger than ever. Not just fear of the unknown, but fear of something ancient, something monstrous, something that should not exist. I turned and ran. Again. But this time, I didn't stop until I burst out of the woods and onto the road, gasping for breath, shivering, feeling like I'd just escaped from something terrible, something hungry. I never went back to those woods, not to hunt, not for anything. I told my dad I wasn't feeling well, that I'd gotten spooked by a bear. He didn't believe me, of course, but he didn't push it. He saw something in my eyes, I think, something he recognized. I never told anyone the real story, not until now, really. What would they say? Crazy Hector seeing monsters in the woods they wouldn't understand. They couldn't. But I know what I saw. I saw those legs, and those tracks. And I know deep down that whatever made them is still out there, somewhere in those woods, maybe in that ravine, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the trees and the house creaks, I still get that feeling. That cold, prickling feeling on the back of my neck, like something is watching, something big, something hairy, something inhuman. And I just close the curtains tight and try not to think about the woods behind the house. The woods that aren't just woods anymore. Not for me, anyway. Not since that day in '59. There's something else now. Something else. And I'm never going back there again. Never. Story 10. Look, I'm not someone who makes things up. I read a lot of stories online, and some of them, they just stick with you, you know? I've never shared anything like this before because, honestly, who'd believe it? But after reading some of the stuff you guys talk about here, maybe someone will get it. It still messes with me, and it happened a long time ago. It was back in the 50s. Yeah, the 1950s. I was fishing and trapping around Mainland Bay. Beautiful place it was. Back then, it felt even wilder, more untouched than it does now. Less people, less noise, just nature. I'd been doing it for years, knew all the little inlets and waterways like the back of my hand. There's this one cove tucked away pretty deep. hard to find unless you knew what you were looking for. It was my go-to spot when I just wanted some peace, you know, away from everyone, just the sounds of the water and the trees. That day, the weather was perfect. One of those crisp, clear days, late fall maybe, where the air's got that bite to it, but the sun still feels warm on your face. The leaves were turning that rusty red and gold, making the woods look like they were on fire in slow motion. I'd been out since early morning, checking my lines, and by midday I was ready for a break. That cove came to mind. I figured I could drop anchor, make a pot of tea, and just be still for a bit. So I steered my boat, a little skiff, nothing fancy, into the maze of waterways that led to the cove. It's winding and twisty, those channels, trees hanging low over the water, branches like crooked fingers reaching down, sunlight patchy, flickering through the leaves. It's beautiful, but it can also feel a little closed in, you know, especially when you're alone. But that was the point. Finally, I reached the cove. It was just as secluded as I remembered. Small, almost circular, surrounded on three sides by thick woods that came right down to the shoreline. The water was still as glass, reflecting the sky and the trees so perfectly it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. The air was quiet, almost silent. Just the faintest rustle of leaves, the gentle lapping of water against the hull of my boat. Perfect. I dropped anchor, careful not to make too much noise, grabbed my little camping stove and my kettle, had some water in a jug, tea leaves in a tin, simple stuff. I found a flat spot on the floor of the boat, away from anything flammable, and set up the stove. Started fiddling with it, trying to get it lit. Those old stoves, they weren't always the easiest to coax to life. While I was messing with the stove, I couldn't shake this feeling though, just a little prickle at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. You know that feeling? Doesn't mean anything bad necessarily, but it makes you just a little bit aware. I glanced around the shoreline, just a quick look. Trees, bushes, shadows, nothing obvious. Probably just my imagination, I told myself. Being alone out here, it can do that to you. Makes you jumpy. I got the stove going finally, that little hiss and sputter of flame. Put the kettle on, started unwrapping some biscuits I'd brought along. Figured I'd have a proper tea break, make the most of it. The water in the kettle started to heat up, humming softly. I leaned back against the side of the boat, soaking up the sun, trying to relax. That feeling of being watched still lingered, but I tried to ignore it. Just nerves, that's all. And then it happened. It was so sudden, so unexpected, it just exploded the peace. 1 second, quiet cove, gentle sun, the promise of hot tea. The next, this sound, a crash, a crackle, like something big moving through the undergrowth, but heavier than anything I'd ever heard before. Deeper, like branches snapping, not under a deer's hooves, but under something huge. I froze, tea forgotten, biscuits forgotten. Every nerve in my body went on high alert. My heart started hammering in my chest, hard and fast. I held my breath, listening, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. The woods were so thick you couldn't see much, shadows deep and dark beneath the trees. The sound came again, closer this time. Definitely from the shoreline, just at the edge of the woods, across from where my boat was anchored. It wasn't just branches breaking anymore, it was rustling, heavy movement through the leaves, like something big was pushing its way through, something massive. I stood up slowly, carefully, my eyes fixed on the trees. My hands were shaking, I realized, palms sweaty, adrenaline starting to pump. What the hell was it? Bare, too heavy, too clumsy sounding, and there was something else in the sound, something deliberate, like it wasn't just moving through the woods, like it was coming towards me. Then the trees moved, not the gentle sway of the breeze, but pushed aside violently as something forced its way through. And then I saw it. just emerging from the shadows of the woods. And I swear, even now, after all these years, just thinking about it, it brings back that same cold dread. It was huge. I mean, really, truly enormous. Taller than any man, wider than any bear. It stood upright, but not human upright. More hunched over, bulky, covered in, I don't even know how to describe it, like matted fur, but darker, almost black in the shadows, but with glints of something reddish-brown in the sun that dappled through the leaves. It was brutish. That's the word that comes to mind. Brutish form, like something half-formed, unfinished, and thrown together all wrong. Thick neck, massive shoulders, long arms that swung low, almost reaching the ground. Its head, it was hard to make out clearly in the shadows, but it was low-set, sloping forehead and just heavy, powerful, ugly. But the worst part, the part that really froze me to the bone, was the eyes. I could see them, even from the boat, gleaming yellowish eyes in the shadows of its face. And they were fixed on me, staring right at me. No mistaking it. It saw me. It was looking at me. And in those eyes, there was something cold, calculating and angry. It didn't roar. It didn't growl. It didn't make any animal sound at all. It just stood there, massive and silent, those eyes locked on mine. And then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it bent down to the ground at the edge of the trees, and it picked something up. I couldn't see what it was at first, just that it was big and heavy. And then it stood up again, holding it in its hands. And I saw. It was a log, not just a branch. A proper log, thick, solid, probably 10 feet long, if not more. The kind of log that would take 2 men to lift. And it held it, easily, like it was nothing, just a stick. And then, still silent, still staring, it threw it, just like that. No warning, no sound, just a sudden movement, a blur of motion, and then the log was hurtling through the air, straight at my boat. It happened so fast I barely had time to react, just a split second to realize what was happening, to see this massive log flying through the air towards me, before impact. It hit the water right beside my boat, with a huge splash. Water showering everywhere. The force of it rocked the skiff violently, tossing me sideways. The kettle went flying, clattering against the side of the boat. The biscuits tumbled onto the floor. My heart leaped into my throat. I scrambled back to my feet, soaked and shaking, staring at the spot where the log had hit. It was floating there now, bobbing in the water, close enough to touch. If it had been aimed just a little differently, it could have smashed right into the boat, sunk me. And I looked back at the shoreline, and it was still there, standing at the edge of the trees, that monstrous shape, still watching, those eyes, still fixed on me. That was it. That was all I needed to see, all I needed to know. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it would throw next, or what it would do if it decided to come into the water. I wasn't going to try and figure out what it was, or why it had done that. All I knew in that moment was that I had to get out of there. Now. I didn't even think. Just pure instinct. Survival. I grabbed the anchor rope, hauled it in, fast as I could. Didn't even bother to stow it properly, just threw it into the boat, jumped to the tiller, yanked the engine cord, prayed it would start. It coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life. Thank God. I jammed it into gear, swung the boat around, and gunned the engine. The little skiff leaped forward, throwing up a spray of water. I didn't look back, didn't dare to, just kept the throttle wide open, steering blindly out of the cove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, out of those narrow waterways, back in the open bay, out of sight of that cove, out of whatever was in those woods. I anchored in a different spot. Exposed, no cover at all, just open water all around. I didn't care. Anything was better than going back there. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, trying to calm down. My hands were still shaking. My legs felt weak. The kettle was lying on its side, hissing steam. The biscuits were scattered on the floor. The log was bobbing in the water back in that cove. And that thing, still in my mind, those eyes, that silent threat. I never went back to that cove, not ever. I fished in other parts of the bay, stayed clear of those waterways. I tried to tell myself it was a bear, a really big, angry bear, that had somehow learned to throw logs. But deep down I knew it wasn't. It wasn't an animal I knew. It wasn't anything I could explain. People talk about things out in the woods sometimes, strange things, things you can't explain, legends, stories. I used to dismiss them, laugh them off. But after that day in the cove, I don't anymore. I know there are things out there we don't understand. Things older than us. Things that don't want to be disturbed. I don't know what that thing was. I don't know why it threw that log. Was it trying to scare me, trying to warn me off? Or was it trying to hurt me, kill me? I honestly don't know. And maybe it's better that way. Maybe some things are just not meant to be known. But I'll never forget it. The silence of that cove, the sound of branches breaking, that monstrous shape emerging from the trees, those eyes, and the log flying through the air. It's a picture that's burned into my memory. A picture that still chills me even now, and every time I'm out on the water, especially near the shoreline, in the trees, I can't help but look. Just a quick glance, you know, to make sure there's nothing there, watching me, waiting, because sometimes late at night when it's quiet, I swear, I can still feel those eyes on me, cold, calculating, and angry, even now, all these years later, and I know somewhere out there in the wild places things like that still exist, unseen, unexplained, and waiting. Story 11. We'd been out since just before dawn, the sky still a bruised purple, the water black and slick as oil. The wind was raw, whipping off the sea, carrying flakes of ice and stinging our faces. We were used to it, of course. Fishermen, you get used to the cold, to the wet, to the early mornings and the long days. But this day, there was something different in the air, something heavier than just the usual winter gloom. Maybe it was just the stillness of the air, the way sound carried across the water, sharp and clear. We were trolling close to shore, hugging the coastline, hoping for a decent haul. The bay was mostly deserted that time of year. Tourists were long gone, tucked away in their warm houses, just us, the gulls and the wind, and whatever else was out there, apparently. We rounded a small headland, the engine chugging steady, when Samson, who was always the one with the sharper eyes, he suddenly pointed towards the beach. "Terence," he says, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Look there, on the beach." I squinted. The winter sun was weak, but reflecting off the snow, making everything glare. At first, I didn't see anything but white sand, drifts piled high against the tree line, the dark green pines hunched over under the weight of the snow. Then I saw it. Standing at the edge of the trees, right where the snow met the sand, there was a figure. It was dark, silhouetted against the snow, and it was moving. Not like a deer, not like anything I'd ever seen before on that beach. My first thought, honestly, was a bear. But bears don't usually come down to the beach in the winter. They hole up, sleep through the worst of it. And this wasn't quite right for a bear. It was too upright, too human-shaped in a way, but not human, not at all. We cut the engine, letting the boat drift. The silence was instant, just the gentle rocking of the hull, the creak of the wood, the distant cry of a gull. And then we could hear it too, the thing on the beach, a kind of rustling, a shifting in the snow. We watched, both of us frozen, staring. It was small, that's the first thing that struck me. Smaller than a man, shorter even than me, and I'm not a big fella, but broad-shouldered, stocky, and covered in fur, dark fur, matted and thick, clinging to its body. It moved again, and I could see its arms swinging. long arms, too long for a man. They almost reached the ground as it walked, sort of shuffling along the sand. Its head was low, tucked down between its shoulders. It was hard to make out any details from the boat. The distance was too great, the light too flat. But there was something about the way it moved, the way it stood, that set my teeth on edge. Samson, he was gripping the gunwale, his knuckles white. He kept staring, never blinking, his breath coming short and fast. We always carried a rifle on the boat. For seals mostly, sometimes for birds if we were desperate. It was just a habit, something you did. Never thought we'd point it at anything like that. "What in God's name is that, Terence?" Samson muttered, his voice rough, like gravel grinding. I shook my head. "I don't know, Sammy. I haven't got a clue." I'd been fishing these waters my whole life, seen seals, whales, dolphins, all kinds of seabirds, even the odd lost dog wandering the beaches. But nothing even close to this. It stopped moving, standing there at the edge of the trees, facing out towards the water. And then it turned its head, just slightly, but it was enough. We saw its face, or what we thought was its face. It was dark, shadowy, hidden under the fur, but there were eyes, 2 eyes, glinting in the pale light. And they were intense, like something wild, something cornered, something afraid maybe, or angry. I couldn't tell. I just knew, looking at those eyes, that whatever it wasn't right. It wasn't natural. Then, without thinking, without saying a word, Samson reached for the rifle. It was leaning against the cabin wall, loaded, ready. He grabbed it, brought it to his shoulder and aimed. My hand shot out, grabbed his arm. "Samson, no! What are you doing?" He didn't even look at me. His eyes were fixed on the figure on the beach, his face set hard. "It's dangerous, Terence. Look at it. It's not right. We have to—" His voice trailed off. He didn't even finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I knew what he meant. Fear. It's a powerful thing. It makes you do stupid things. Before I could say another word, before I could wrestle the rifle from his grasp, he fired. The sound ripped through the still air, echoing across the water, shattering the silence. The recoil kicked the rifle hard against his shoulder. The figure on the beach, it jumped, violently, like it had been electrocuted, and then it screamed. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard, not a roar, not a growl, not a bark. It was higher-pitched, almost human, but twisted, raw, filled with pain and terror and something else, something ancient, something primal. The sound cut right through me, went straight to my gut. It wasn't just loud, it vibrated in the air, in my chest, in my teeth. It was a scream that chilled you to the bone, made your blood run cold. I felt my own breath catch in my throat, my heart hammering against my ribs. The creature turned, spun around and scrambled back towards the trees. It moved fast now, unbelievably fast, bounding through the snow, disappearing into the shadows of the woods. The scream faded, replaced by the rustling of branches, the snapping of twigs. Then silence again, but a different kind of silence. A heavy silence. A silence filled with dread. Samson lowered the rifle, his face pale, his eyes wide. He looked at me, then at the trees, then back at me. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. We just stood there, staring at the woods, listening to the wind whisper through the branches, the silence ringing in our ears. After a long moment, Samson finally spoke, his voice hoarse. Did I hit it, Terence?" I didn't know. I hadn't seen it fall. I hadn't seen anything except it vanish into the trees, but there had been something that made my stomach churn. "I don't know, Sammy," I said slowly, my voice trembling slightly. "But I think so." And then I saw it. On the snow, right where the creature had been standing, a splash of red, crimson red against the pristine white. Blood. Not a lot, just a stain, spreading slowly in the snow. But enough. Enough to tell us that Samson's shot had found its mark. The bravado, whatever little we'd had, it vanished then, replaced by something cold and heavy, something that felt like guilt and fear and something else, something I couldn't name. We should go ashore, Samson said, his voice hesitant now, unsure. We should see if... He didn't finish that sentence either. We both knew what we should see if. We should see if we'd killed it. We should see what it was. We should know. But the thought of it, the thought of going into those woods, of following that blood trail, of facing whatever was out there, it filled me with a terror I'd never felt before, a deep, primal fear that clawed at my insides. We looked at each other. Samson, big Samson, the man who could haul nets single-handed, the man who'd faced down storms and raging seas without flinching, he looked scared, truly scared. And so was I. "No," I said, shaking my head. "No, Sammy, we shouldn't. We should go, now." He looked at me for a moment, his eyes searching mine. I think he saw the fear in my face, reflected back at him, and then he nodded, slowly. "Yeah," he whispered. "Yeah, you're right. Let's go." We didn't even look back. Samson turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and roared to life. He slammed the throttle forward, and the boat surged ahead, slicing through the water, away from the shore, away from the beach, away from the woods. We didn't say another word to each other as we headed back out to sea. The wind seemed colder now, the sky darker, the whole world felt different, tainted somehow. We fished for a couple more hours, going through the motions, hauling nets, baiting hooks, but our hearts weren't in it. We were just going through the motions, trying to pretend everything was normal, but it wasn't. Nothing was normal anymore. We came back in late afternoon, unloaded our meager catch, and went our separate ways. We didn't talk about it. Not then, not ever really. We just pretended it hadn't happened, but it did happen. I know it did. I saw it. Samson saw it. We both heard that scream. We both saw the blood on the snow. And I've never forgotten it. Not a single day has gone by since then that I haven't thought about it, haven't wondered what it was, what we did. Did we kill it? Did it survive? Was it just some strange animal? Or was it something else entirely? Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside and the house creaks and groans, I think about those woods, about what might be lurking there still, watching, waiting. And I wonder, what if it wasn't alone? What if there were others? What if they remember us? What if they are still angry? I know it sounds crazy. I know people wouldn't believe me if I told them. Fishermen's tales, they'd say, seafarers' madness, but I swear to you, every word of it is true. We saw something that day, on Watson Bay, something we weren't meant to see. And I'll carry that fear, that uncertainty with me until the day I die. The worst part is, we ran. We shot at it, wounded it, and then we ran. We left it there, bleeding in those woods, and we never went back to see what we'd done. We just left it to whatever fate awaited it. And that haunts me most of all, the not knowing, the feeling that we did something terrible, something we can never undo, and that maybe, just maybe, someday, something will come looking for us for what we did that day on Watson Bay. I still wake up sometimes in a cold